The Earth, our planet, our home, filled with wondrous species and countless fascinating ecosystems. Yet despite our best efforts to conserve it, it's actively on fire and we're all going to die.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
I would tend to agree. To be fair though, talking about conservation isn't really easy, regardless of how long we've been doing it. There's so many problems going on in the world today that it's easy for us to feel overwhelmed. Or worse, for us to overwhelm our guests at the zoo. The good news though is that there's a lot of hope for the future, and each and every one of us has a part to play in guiding that narrative. In today's ICZ talk on conservation messaging, we'll be discussing how you can take your conservation messages to the next level and guide your guests towards actionable conservation initiatives to make a real difference in this awesome world we all call home. I'm your host, zoo educator Trevor Suich, and without further ado, let's dive right in to talking about me, since you probably have no idea who I am or what my qualifications are for giving a talk like this. For 10 years, I worked as an educator and media spokesperson for Busch Gardens, Tampa, Florida. In my time at Busch Gardens, I was fortunate to not only work with a wide variety of animals and guests, but to also travel with our animals for media blitzes across the country, serving as a spokesperson to highlight our organization's global conservation efforts. During my later years at the zoo, I put my experiences to work developing communications training, media training, and conservation messaging training for our various zoological teams. Like so many others in our field, I lost my job during the COVID shutdowns of 2020. Although it was certainly a difficult time, this unexpected break from, well, life, gave me the time and energy I needed to assemble a team and create an animal educational show called Animal Mysteries. Our series takes a sassy look at some of the biggest myths and misconceptions surrounding animals, with a focus on catering to older kids and adults, the ones most often left out of animal educational programming. We'll be covering all the myths that folks in our field love to hate, so be sure to check us out after our presentation today. Thanks to the help of my amazing creative team, today's talk on conservation messaging will combine my years of experience and a flair for dramatic with their unmatched cinematic skills. So sit back, relax, and welcome to my Trev Talk. I will not apologize for that. Before we get into the how, let's ask the why. Why do we talk about conservation? To save the planet. Okay, we know. I mean, besides that. Obviously, we talk about conservation because we want to help the planet, but there's more reasons to talk about conservation than just that. Arguably, the biggest one is that most people don't understand that it's such a critical part of why modern-day zoos and aquariums exist. Remember, zoos were originally designed as simple menageries that existed for idle distractions, not as places of learning that promote the protection of species and their habitats. For most of the general public, I'd argue that the average image of zoos and aquariums hasn't quite kept up with the evolution of our mission. Look at any children's book about a zoo, and I guarantee you it shows big animals in tiny cages with concrete floors, bars, no enrichment, and a zookeeper sweeping the floor. Just because we know it's no longer 1899, we can't assume the public knows that too. Given the constant assault our images are under, now more than ever it's so incredibly important to educate our guests, not only about the conservation plights our animals face, but also about all the work that our organizations are doing to help, and to share ways for our guests to get involved in that process. It's an unfortunate fact of life, but zoos and aquariums can only exist as long as the public that funds us finds value in our institutions. Sharing the work we do to support the conservation of our animals is not only vital to conserve the wild, but also to conserve our own status in the eyes of the public. If we're not careful, our facilities and the crucial work they provide could go extinct in our lifetimes. And so now that we've been talking doom and gloom, let's lighten the mood by getting off that subject and moving into how we talk about all the doom and gloom.
This is fine.
Despite the fact that in some cases the world is literally on fire, we always need to remember to balance all that doom and gloom with hope. Remember, most people visit the zoo to have a good time, not to be sent into 2020 levels of depression and anxiety. One of the major challenges of learning to talk about conservation is learning to balance. We absolutely don't want to ignore the problems facing our animals and planet, but we also can't fixate on them either. Doing so risks turning your audience off to the message of how they can help before you even get there. Acknowledge the problems we face, but put the emphasis on the solutions guests can be a part of, not the problems themselves. An excellent way to find your balance is by incorporating humor into your talks. Obviously, we don't want to dilute the very real conservation challenges that we're facing, but by balancing the serious with the humorous, you not only hold your audience's attention, but also add emphasis to the more serious bits. One of my favorite examples of this balance comes from the Rainforest Alliance's Follow the Frog campaign, which if you haven't watched, you absolutely should. Love them or hate them, their commercial does an excellent job taking a scary subject like habitat loss and not only keeps the viewer engaged throughout, but it also leaves them with a simple, actionable message that they can start doing today. And speaking of messages,
I don't know what we're yelling about!
what is your message? What is it that you're trying to get your audience to do? This is what we call a call to action, or CTA. It's a core message that's designed to provoke an immediate, often emotional response in your audience to encourage them to perform an action. In our case, the call to action is the conservation message itself, with the action being, well, getting our guests to help us save the planet, which is kind of a big ask. So let's make that big ask more manageable by exploring some popular conservation messages and how to use them effectively. To make sure we're not overwhelming people with our call to actions, it's important that we cater them to our audience. But who exactly is that audience? Answering that question lets us choose the messages that are most relevant to our current guests. I like to divide conservation messages into two categories: simple, feel-good messages for audiences that just came for a good time, and deeper, more complex messages for audiences looking to get involved and make more of an impact. It's important to note that you don't have to choose between a simple or complex conservation message in advance of your talks. You should instead determine the makeup of your audience while you present and organically determine which type of message would have the best effect. In some cases, it might even make sense to use one of each. One of the most common simple conservation messages I often hear is encouraging people to recycle, which was an excellent conservation message back in the 1990s. Now, I'm not saying it's bad to encourage people to recycle, far from it. But the reality is, at this point, we have to question how effective an oversaturated message like "please recycle" really is, especially when we have so many other messages to choose from. Plus, with the current state of the global markets, a lot of recycling just gets turned into waste. While encouraging guests to recycle isn't a bad message, I'd argue it's the bare minimum. If your presentations center around a recycling message, it might be more effective to drill down into the specifics of recycling, explaining which materials can and cannot be recycled, that plastic bags or styrofoam often can't be disposed of in a general recycling bin, or giving guests information on where to dispose of household hazardous materials or electronics. Never forget that the goal of a conservation message is to motivate a guest to perform an action. If they're already doing that action, or doing that action incorrectly, you might want to consider a new message or a new way to share your message to reshape your guests' behaviors for the better. The goal of a simple conservation message often revolves around an important question. What can a guest start doing today to help out? An excellent conservation message to answer that question would be to not just encourage responsible purchasing habits, but to show guests the tools available to help them out with that process. There are a ton of organizations that label products or businesses as environmentally responsible. While these organizations are by no means equal, deciding on which ones are the most relevant to your organization allows you to empower your audience to make choices that benefit global conservation efforts when overwhelmed by product choice.
Ketchup? Ketchup. Ketchup.
One of my favorite simple conservation messages follows closely with responsible purchasing habits. Encourage your guests to support accredited zoological facilities. Just like with our previous example, not all certifications and accreditations are created equal. Remember though, our goal with this message is to find a way to empower our guests to support zoological facilities whose conservation principles align with our own. By determining which organizations share those principles with us, we can give guests the tools they need to help support our broader mission. The best part about this particular conservation message is that it gives a guest a way to not only experience other zoos and aquariums, but also helps them feel good about doing so. For example, the AZA requires all accredited facilities to participate in species survival plans, field conservation programs, and conservation programs with colleges and universities. While this is just a small part of what the AZA accreditation means, it lets guests know how they specifically support conservation efforts with every visit to the zoo. My all-time favorite simple conservation message is the easiest and arguably most helpful one to our daily operations, telling guests how their visit helps directly support our own conservation efforts. We all know that our facilities do some amazing conservation work and strive to make a positive impact on our world, but guests rarely understand the full extent of what we do. Never forget, most guests don't truly understand the role of modern-day zoos and aquariums, so this is your chance to both educate them and encourage them to keep coming back. When our guests pay to visit us, they do more than simply pay our salaries and keep our animals comfortable and fed. They're also directly funding our ability to keep our conservation efforts going. Showing those guests the species survival plans you participate in, the conservation groups you support, and the research you do does more than just give them that warm, fuzzy feeling. It inspires them to want to keep visiting because they see firsthand how their visits support conservation efforts worldwide. Don't just thank your guests for visiting, explain your thanks by sharing how they play a vital part in that mission. A popular, if arguably complex, conservation message is teaching guests about the illegal wildlife trade and encouraging them not to support it. The big challenge with this message is recognizing that, depending upon where you're located, you might not really be talking to the right audience.
Do you even go to this school?
No. For instance, I've seen educators and zookeepers alike give talks on rhino conservation, where the core conservation message was that rhino horn had no medicinal value and as such should not be purchased. While "please don't support rhino poaching" is a nice feel-good message, I'm pretty sure that most of the guests who received that message were not previously planning on flying to Africa to shoot a rhino, or even buying one of their horns. This message shares a lot with the "please recycle" message we discussed earlier. The core intent is a good message, but we have to think about how relevant that message is to the audience we're presenting to. While it may be more relevant to an audience from countries known for consuming rhino horn, we also have to consider cultural sensitivities when phrasing such a message. None of this is to say you shouldn't use this message. It's more to say you should consider how you use this message. What can your guests do to help? Consider pointing them towards organizations that work to combat the illegal wildlife trade, or educating them about business types that might not have conservation in their mission. Don't forget, our own facilities often work with many groups that combat this problem, so this message can pair nicely with the "support your local zoos" message from earlier. The key point here is to not just educate our guests about the problems the illegal wildlife trade causes, but to provide solutions that empower our more motivated guests to help the organizations that combat it. While general conservation messages are all well and good, sometimes we want to get a little more specific. There's a ton of amazing conservation initiatives aimed at helping specific species. Purchasing sustainable seafood to protect our oceans, recycling cell phones to protect gorillas, or sustainable palm oil shopping to protect orangutans, just to name a few. These initiatives really give us an outlet to share a message with guests as to how they can directly protect the species and habitats we help them connect with. I like to think of these types of messages as the extra credit for the guests that want to take their purchasing and recycling habits to the next level. While most of these initiatives take a little more effort than looking for a logo, clearly explaining them to your guests can help them find ways to make a direct impact on the protection of species and habitats worldwide. When sharing these messages, make sure that you have a clear way of sharing the tools available to them. Consider having cards to pass out with QR codes linking to an app, sharing small booklets or leaflets with instructions, or even having signage that leads your guests to more information and resources. Remember, don't just share the problem with your guests, share the tools they need to be a part of the solution. One of the most powerful and simultaneously controversial conservation messages is to encourage guests to support conservation-focused legislation. This is a powerful message as it encourages your guests to play an active role in shaping your country's environmental policies, like habitat protection and climate change. But it's also a landmine of potential controversies because of that dreaded word:
politics.
The fastest way to embroil a company in scandal is to support one politician or party over another. Literally nothing alienates your guests faster than this. As difficult as it can be for us to not take sides, trust me, I'm an American, I know. We have to remember to focus our support specifically for individual policies and laws, not for the people or parties who represent them. Highlighting the success of previous conservation policies can be a great way to organically transition into support for similar ones, while also steering away from getting embroiled in the political struggle. Just be careful. If your goal is to make your conservation message one of encouraging support for these types of policies, I'd highly encourage you to work with your teams to craft them. Don't be afraid to use such messages, just remember to be cautious with how they're applied, and never be afraid to ask others for help when designing them. Whew! So that felt like a lot of conservation messages, but as you're all aware, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. While there are a ton more to explore, when emphasizing a point, it's also important to consider, how do we get there?
Brilliant! I have absolutely no idea what's going on.
We are the authors of our own messages, and that means we can and should start at the end of the story when writing them. One of the best ways to create a strong presentation with a strong message is to start with that message and work backwards to figure out how you want to get there. For instance, if I wanted to give a cheetah talk with a message of support for the Cheetah Conservation Fund, I'd start by writing my message about the CCF and then work backwards to get to that message in an organized fashion. I'd write in the challenges facing cheetah conservation before my message, general facts about the cheetah before that, an introduction of myself and the cheetahs before that, and voila! I've got myself an organized cheetah talk ready to roll. And this is obviously an oversimplified example leaving out a lot of details, but it's a great way to give yourself a rough outline before starting a talk. Even if you don't have time to write everything out, visualizing your message and the path you'll take to get there can help you organize your thoughts and make your message much more comprehensible and easy to follow. Ah, the good old inverted pyramid. The best technique no one in our field has ever heard of. This technique is commonly used by journalists looking to better organize the flow of their thoughts, and pairs nicely with our previous technique of knowing where we want a presentation to go. The inverted pyramid allows us to organize our information for better communication, with several ways of applying it. In our case, the top of the pyramid is where we start with our message, with information that grabs the audience's attention and gets them primed to learn more. The next level is where we build anticipation for that message, as we add in more information now that we have their focus. Finally, the bottom of the pyramid is reserved for our call to action, the conservation message itself that we want our guests to act upon. To use this in an example, let's go back to our talk about the Cheetah Conservation Fund. When it's time for our message, I'd use the top of the pyramid to grab the audience's attention with how cheetahs are facing a large number of threats to their survival. I'd then transition to the middle of the pyramid, where I'd explain how organizations such as the Cheetah Conservation Fund are working to protect cheetahs worldwide. Finally, I'd arrive at the bottom of the pyramid, my call to action, that because our zoo uses our revenue and donations to support the Cheetah Conservation Fund, a visit to the zoo directly supports cheetah conservation efforts. Arguably the greatest tool in our arsenal for creating strong conservation messages are the stories we use to share them. People remember stories, not statistics. If you can somehow combine your messages with stories that create an emotional response in your audience, you'll have a much higher chance of seeing people act on those messages. For instance, I used to work in the Busch Gardens Animal Care Center, our zoo hospital that was open to guests. In addition to caring for our own animals, we cared for thousands of rescued wildlife cases as well, with the goal of rehabilitating them back into the wild. One of those cases was a female red-shouldered hawk that was brought to us with a broken wing after she was struck by a car. After an exhaustive 3 months of surgery, physical therapy, and flight training, she was finally ready for release. Upon returning her to where she'd been found, however, the team made a surprise discovery. Another hawk was already there waiting for her. Fortunately, it wasn't a rival bird moving in on her territory. It was actually her mate, who had been anxiously waiting those 3 months for her to return. It might sound a bit sappy and walks a fine line of anthropomorphizing a rescued hawk, but that story is 100% true. And while people hearing that story won't remember every detail from it, they'll remember how it made them feel. By combining those feelings with the message of how our guests directly supported our conservation efforts with their visits, we helped convince thousands of guests to keep supporting us financially. Many would often tell us that our facility was the sole reason they kept renewing their passes. As an added note, don't be afraid to share your personal stories with guests. By sharing the laughs and the tears you've experienced in the field, you help your guests to connect with your animals on a much deeper level. Again, we want to be careful about overly anthropomorphizing our animals, but creating emotional connections between your guests and animals is an excellent way to get your audience much more invested in how they can help. Arguably, the number one technique that people learn in media training is how to block and bridge. While this is an extremely important skill to master for interviews, it's also incredibly useful to help us keep control of our messages, as anyone who's ever had to teach a group of teenagers undoubtedly knows. Blocking is relatively straightforward. It's where a speaker avoids an unwelcome or unproductive question that threatens to derail the presentation. However, it should almost always be followed by bridging, the process of guiding the conversation away from the unfriendly or controversial territory and back towards the point of your conservation message. Bridging allows you to smoothly transition either back to your message after blocking a question or simply to move more organically from point to point. It also triggers your audience to pay attention as you move towards your message, as it helps you highlight the things that are the most relevant to them. There's an insane number of bridging statements out there for you to use, and as the name implies, all are designed to help bridge your various ideas and concepts for your audience. As an important note, we should try to block questions only as a last resort. We never want the public to think we're hiding things from them, but we also can't let controversial or off-topic questions derail our efforts to get to our conservation message. It's completely okay, and I'd argue encouraged to acknowledge someone's question, tell them there isn't time in the current talk to answer it, but offer to stick around to dive in deeper once you finish. While there are so many more things to talk about here, I've been getting informed from my editors that they're getting really tired of looking at my face. And we have to bring things to a close. But before we do, let's summarize some of the key points from today's talk and toss in some extra credit. First and foremost, make sure your message is one of hope, not despair. Don't let your guests get lost in the sea of negativity before you even get to your message. Rather, focus on lifting them up with hope for the future. Second, determine what your message is in advance of your talk and consider how you plan to get there. Make sure to determine if your message is a simple or complex one and be prepared to adapt that message depending upon what's best for your current audience. Third, figure out the techniques you plan to use to communicate your message. Whether that's through emotional connections via stories or organizing your thoughts with the inverted pyramid theory, determine how you'll guide your audience to your call to action. And finally, something we didn't get to cover, consider ways that you can boost your message further. Whether that's working with PR and marketing to create social media posts, creating new tours focused on conservation issues, or working across departments to design new guest experiences and signage, always be looking for more ways to bring more attention to the issues that matter most. Hopefully you've enjoyed our talk today on conservation messaging and maybe even learned a thing or two along the way. By focusing on our messages, we can really develop our guests into more than just advocates for our organizations. We can help them become advocates for entire ecosystems, even the planet itself. While it's a bit overused, I always like to end these types of talks by circling back to that famous quote from Baba Dione. In the end, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. If we can teach our guests to truly understand the animals and world around them, that understanding helps us inspire a deep and genuine love for the earth. And through that love, we find the passion that drives us to fight to conserve wildlife for generations to come. Always remember that you yourself have the ability to light that spark of passion in those you meet, and you do so every day. Thank you again for watching today's talk, and thank you truly for doing all that you do to conserve this big, beautiful planet we all share.